Trump's power didn't just crack today, it collapsed, and the political world is in absolute meltdown. A federal judge just froze every asset Trump controls, and the fallout is already spilling into Washington like a political earthquake nobody saw coming. His towers, his cash flow, his federal spending authority, all locked, triggering chaos across agencies and panic inside his circle. This isn't a setback. It's a full-scale shutdown of the empire he built. And the truth pouring out right now is so explosive, it's forcing lawmakers into emergency walkouts and backroom deals. Because if this freeze holds, Trump's entire future might already be over, or something even bigger is coming next.
Let's go to the US now, where Donald Trump has posted a $175 million bond in his New York civil fraud case. In February, he was found to have fraudulently inflated property values. It means he can now proceed with his appeal against a $454 million fine without the possible seizure of his assets. Mr. Trump claims it's all a political witch hunt. Of course, this is just one of several court cases he's facing, with others being criminal cases, with the potential for Mr. Trump to be jailed if convicted.
Trump's power doesn't end in one dramatic moment. It doesn't end because of a single headline or a viral thumbnail with flames and red arrows. If anything, that stuff protects him because it turns a very real, very serious fight over money and the rule of law into cheap entertainment. What's actually happening is slower and more uncomfortable. Courts, auditors, watchdogs, and ordinary people are steadily pushing back against a man who spent his entire public life treating money, public or private, like it's his personal weapon. And every time one of those institutions quietly says no, a little bit of that power erodes. Let's start with the big lie baked into a lot of the online noise. There is no real-world, nationwide, total freeze on every dollar Donald Trump owns and every government dollar he touches. That fantasy is great for thumbnails, but it isn't how the law works. What we do have is more interesting and in the long run, way more dangerous for him. Targeted court rulings, blocked policy moves, and financial judgments that hem him in inch by inch.
Donald Trump's narrow escape from financial calamity is raising a few eyebrows today.
Earlier this year, Trump's White House tried something that tells you exactly how he sees the presidency. With one memo, officials moved to pause or slow roll huge categories of federal grants and loans under the excuse of reviewing spending and rooting out supposedly woke or wasteful projects. On paper, it sounded bureaucratic. In reality, it landed like a grenade. State governments suddenly weren't sure whether planned projects would be funded. Universities had no idea if long-term research grants would continue. Nonprofits that live month to month on federal support were staring at budgets with giant question marks, where firm commitments had been. The administration was trying to turn the federal checkbook into a political cudgel, reward the right people, squeeze the wrong ones, without actually going back to Congress. That's the key point. The Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse. Congress decides how money gets spent. The president's job is to execute those decisions. Every time Trump has bumped up against that limit, whether it was trying to siphon Pentagon funds for a wall or, more recently, trying to freeze big swaths of grants and loans, the same collision happens. His CEO president fantasy crashes into the boring reality of separation of powers. And the courts, which he loves to dismiss as rigged when they don't do his bidding, have been crystal clear about this. Judges looked at that funding freeze and basically said, no, you don't get to unilaterally shut the spigot off. They pointed out there was no statute that let him do it, no emergency that justified it, no legal framework at all beyond the White House wants this. So they did what courts are supposed to do when the executive branch steps outside the law. They stopped it. What's easy to miss here is who was standing behind those lawsuits. It wasn't just abstract activists. It was states, cities, public universities, hospital systems, scientific institutions, civil legal aid organizations, people whose entire mission is to take federal dollars voted on by Congress and turn them into schools, clinics, labs, housing, food assistance. When those groups go to court and swear under oath that a sudden funding freeze would be economically catastrophic, that's not a talking point. That's payroll. That's rent. That's medication. That's whether a program even survives to the end of the year. So yes, judges blocked Trump's move. They cited the Constitution, existing law, past Supreme Court decisions on impoundment and spending. They said what should be obvious. If a president can randomly freeze Congress's money every time he wants leverage, then Congress doesn't really control the purse anymore. And if Congress doesn't control the purse, you've basically hollowed out one of the core checks on executive power. That's the first layer of this story. Trump tries to weaponize public money, courts push back, and ordinary people get caught in the crossfire while the courts sort it out. The second layer is his personal finances, the thing he built his political brand on. In New York, judges have already found that Trump and his company spent years inflating asset values to get better loan terms and insurance deals. It wasn't just a little rounding error. It was systematic. It was repeated. And it was deliberate enough that a court called it what it was, fraud. That's why you saw that eye-popping civil judgment, hundreds of millions of dollars on the line. And that's why the fight over the appeal bond mattered so much. In the real world, when you want to appeal a huge money judgment, you don't just shout witch hunt into a camera. You post a bond, often close to the full amount, to prove that if you lose the appeal, the money will actually be there. That's the law for rich and poor defendants alike. Trump hit a wall there. His lawyers told a court they'd gone to dozens of surety companies and couldn't get anyone to back the full bond under the terms required. That's remarkable. For a guy who built his entire persona around the idea that banks line up to do business with him, suddenly he's the client nobody wants to touch without massive conditions. That's not some fictional asset freeze. That's the market and the legal system sending a very clear message. You are not a normal borrower, and your word is not enough. An appeals court later reduced the penalty and adjusted terms, but they didn't throw out the core finding. He and his company lied. They cheated. They broke the rules in ways that mattered to lenders, investors, and the public. The courts are basically forcing him to live in a world he's never liked, a world where numbers have to be real, documents have to be honest, and power doesn't automatically rewrite the balance sheet. Put those two tracks together, the attempt to freeze huge chunks of federal spending and the civil fraud judgments in New York, and a consistent pattern emerges. Trump treats money, whether it's taxpayer money or investor money, as something that exists to serve him. When he wants to punish an enemy, he reaches for the budget. When he wants to pump up his image, he reaches for inflated valuations. And when the legal system says you can't do that, he calls it persecution. Here's where we need to talk about disinformation, because the way this all gets covered online is part of the story. There are channels right now pumping out videos with titles like "Judge Freezes Trump's Assets Nationwide" or "Trump's Power Ends Tonight, Financial Meltdown." And then buried deep in the description, or spoken once at the end, there's a little phrase, "This video is fictional," or "This is a dramatization." Let's be honest, most viewers never see that disclaimer. They see the title, the thumbnail, the out-of-context clip, and they walk away believing something happened that simply didn't. On the surface, it looks anti-Trump. It looks like accountability. But in practice, it does two things that help him. First, it trains people to expect a Hollywood ending. If you're told every week that this is the end and it's all over, you start to tune out when real, meaningful, but incremental accountability happens. A funding freeze gets blocked in court, snooze. A civil fraud judgment stands on appeal, whatever. I saw a video that said all his money was gone months ago. Second, it gives him an easy target. When he wants to discredit real investigations, he can point to the fake stuff and say, "See, they make things up about me all the time." And he's not wrong about those specific videos. They are made up. So instead of arguing about the actual court orders that blocked his funding overreach or the actual fraud findings in New York, we end up arguing about nonsense that never happened. That's why pro-democracy commentary has to be grounded, even when we're furious. You don't beat a liar by becoming a more entertaining liar. You beat a liar by doing what the judges in these cases are doing, assembling facts, putting them under oath, and writing them down in ways that will outlast any news cycle. And those facts are damning enough. Fact: Trump tried to use executive power to put a huge chill on federal grants and loans, and courts said no. Fact: Judges warned that what the White House was doing had no clear legal authority and threatened the constitutional balance over spending. Fact: Real Americans, veterans, students, patients, workers would have paid the price if those freezes had stayed in place. Fact: Trump's own companies had been found liable for civil fraud. Fact: The numbers he bragged about for years don't match the numbers he's been forced to submit when someone's finally checking. Fact: He struggled to find financial firms willing to back his appeal bond, which is not what happens to a universally trusted businessman. Does that mean Trump power ends? No. Authoritarians don't just disappear because a judge writes a tough order, but it does mean something important. His power is no longer unchecked. Judges have drawn lines he can't cross without consequences. Regulators and attorneys general have put his finances under scrutiny in ways that permanently change how banks and partners see him. Members of Congress, even in his own party, now have to calculate whether hitching themselves to him is worth the risk when his legal and financial troubles keep piling up. And that's where you, the viewer, come in. Because this isn't just about one man or one set of cases. Every time a court says, you can't freeze Congress's money for political reasons, it's creating a precedent that will apply to any president who tries the same trick in the future. Every time a judge says, you can't inflate your way to the top and call it success, it's sending a message to every would-be strongman who thinks you can lie your way into untouchable status. We're in a long, painful stress test of the American system. Can a president with a cult-like base, a massive propaganda machine, and a lifetime of skating past consequences be brought to heel by institutions that were designed for a more normal era? The answer so far isn't a clean yes or no. Some institutions have failed, some have bent, but some, courts, juries, watchdogs, are still doing the work. That's why it's so important to resist the urge to tell ourselves fairy tales, even comforting ones. It would feel good to believe that a single nationwide asset freeze order has already solved the Trump problem. It hasn't. What we have instead is more complicated, more fragile, and more real. A slow constriction of his ability to do whatever he wants with other people's money, whether those other people are taxpayers or lenders. And that slow constriction matters. It makes it harder for him to finance vanity projects, harder to move money around in the dark without someone asking questions, harder to use the federal budget as a political bludgeon against entire states or communities, harder to sell the myth that he's the unbeatable, untouchable billionaire who always wins. In the end, the real story here isn't Trump power ends. It's Trump power meets something bigger than Trump. It meets the Constitution. It meets courts that still, despite everything, issue rulings based on law instead of loyalty. It meets public servants in agencies who refuse to shred the rules just because the White House demands it. It meets voters, activists, journalists, and yes, even skeptical viewers who are tired of being lied to from every direction. If you care about democracy, this is where your focus should be, on the legal fights over who controls public money, on the fraud cases that drag fake numbers into the light, on the judges who write in dry, careful language that no president is above the law. That story isn't as flashy as a flaming thumbnail. It won't go as viral as Trump power ends tonight. But it's the only story that actually changes what happens next. Because Trump's real fear isn't a dramatic made-for-TV asset freeze. His real fear is something much less cinematic and much more permanent. A system that keeps working, case by case, order by order, election by election, until the office he's trying to twist into a throne is brought back down to size.